Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum. Welcome to 2nd Chronicles, chapter 23, in which there are 21 verses. Beginning in verse 1, it says the 8th year versus the 7th year. And then it says here, with him unto the house of Hashem, versus into covenant with him. So he simply brought them into the house, the temple. Here it says in the Masoretic, they entered a covenant, so much more serious affair. Verse 3, there's an omission of Judah, the congregation of Judah specifically, and it says, and he showed them the king's son. So although it's implied in the Masoretic, it's not as clear that that is what happened. He's simply saying, behold the king's son, but not actually showing him or showing them the king's son. Whereas in the Septuagint, it is very clear that's what he did. And then he goes on to follow showing them the king's son, presenting him with the words, look, let the king's son reign, as Hashem said concerning the house of David. Verse 4, even into the gates of the entrances. So these are, this is describing a specific location which they will enter into or through. Verses shall be porters of the doors. So he is assigning them designated roles or positions that are assigned to them. Verse 5, at the middle gate versus at the gate of the foundation. Verse 6, there's an omission of and the Levites. And then it says here, and the servants of the Levites versus they that minister of the Levites. So these are those who are Levites who are ministering, whereas in the Septuagint, they could be non-Levites who simply serve the Levites, but are not necessarily Levites themselves. Okay, verse 8. It says, from the beginning of the Sabbath to the end of the Sabbath, verses that were come in on the Sabbath with them, that were to go. Let me just read it on the script. It says, every man his men, and took every man his men that were to come in on the Sabbath with them that were to go out on the Sabbath. So the Septuagint is describing a specific time period that is the start of the Shabbat and until the end of Shabbat, versus they are free to choose to come and go whenever they want, as they please during any part of the Shabbat. So that is not what happened, as the Masoretic is saying. It is as the Septuagint says, they are to be assigned from the start into the end of the Shabbat. So it's pretty clear. They can't just choose when they want to do their duty. It has to be done throughout the day, the Shabbat specifically. Verse 9, different weapons being described, swords versus spears, and then we have arms versus bucklers. Verse 11, it says, he brought out the king's son versus they brought out the king's son. And it says here, and Jehoiada, in Greek Jode, the priest and his sons, proclaimed him king versus they made him king. And it is unclear who it is referring to by they. Could be the Levites, could even be the captains, could be the army, or even the people in general, perhaps. So it's not as specific. It's not as specific as the Septuagint is. Okay, and then they have this this saying that is still used even in modern day England, for instance. They use this term, God save the king or the queen, whereas in the Septuagint, it's not saying God save him. It's not like it needs to be saved from something. It simply says, long live the king. And that is a famous saying as well. Verse 12, went into the king. This is talking about Athaliah versus she came to the people. Why would she go to the people? Well, there's a noise, but she came into the presence of the king, not right in front of the king. So that's a security issue. Okay, so that is verse 11, verse 12, or verse 13, I should say. In his place, so she looked, and behold, the king stood in his place, versus at his pillar, at the entering in. And it says here, and the princes were round the king. They're surrounding him, versus by the king. They're just near him. And then we have a significant difference, perhaps even a big difference. This is Athaliah now renting her robe versus clothes. And she cried out loud, you surely are plotting against me. That is a more complex statement compared to the Masoretic, which is simply treason, treason. So she's not saying, not even who's doing treason and against who. In the Septuagint, she identifies both parties. You are the ones committing treason, plotting against who? Me. Well, that was inserted to me, in all fairness. In verse 14, Jehoiada went forth, verses brought out the captains. And then it says, thrust her. These are his instructions. Thrust her forth outside the house. So you can pretty much replace it with pierce through her outside of the house. Don't do it in the temple. Versus have her forth of the ranges. So that can be a little cryptic, that statement, but means to essentially thrust her through outside of the house, because the word for ranges is beit, which is house in Hebrew. And the significant difference again regarding the instructions he's providing, it says here, and follow her, and let her, Athaliah, be slain with the sword. So he's referring to Athaliah and with both hers. In the Masoretic, it's quite a different instruction. It says, whoever follows her, whoso follows her, let him be slain with the sword. Why would anyone follow her? It doesn't make sense. It's going to be a bloodbath. No, you only need to target her, no one else. And then the last part of instructions are follow her. Actually, this is my own paraphrasing. Follow her and end her. Versus whoever follows her and them. Again, makes no sense. Why would you have piles of bodies mounting up? Verse 15, we have a big difference. It says, so they let her go. They let who go? Athaliah. They let her go out from the place. And then they followed her as she left. That's the instructions. Follow her. So they did let her go, but they pursued her. And then she went through the horseman's gate. And there they slew her, as was instructed by the king. Who was the one? It was Jehoiada. Sorry, it's the priest, not the king. What did they do in the Masoretic? Did they let her go? No, they didn't. This is the focus of this video. The title of this video. So they laid hands on her. No, they did not lay hands on her. Otherwise, she couldn't escape. She couldn't leave the house. So they let her go. She has to go out of the house. Otherwise, if they lay hands on her in the temple, she can't leave. So it doesn't make any sense. So that is a big difference. Did they lay hands on her? Answer, no. Did they let her go out? Answer is yes. Verse 17. It says here, powder. They crushed the images to powder versus pieces. And then we have an omission in verse 18. A significant difference as well. It says, and this is talking about Jehoiada, the priest. He reestablished the courses of the priests and Levites. So that was not being kept anymore. He reestablished it, he restored it. That's an important action that he performed. He's restoring the proper way of things that David had instituted, King David. Verse 20, heads of families versus captains of hundreds, and then it mentions nobles versus mighty men. And then it talks about the inner gate versus the high gate. And that's it. That's all for this chapter. Thank you very much for your time. Till next time, I bid you all shalom aleichem, assalamu alaikum, irini mazisu, pax vobiscum, peace be unto you, and maranatha.